We begin this morning, of course, with former Secretary of State Colin Powell, who died yesterday due to COVID-19 complications. He was 84 years old.
Yeah, and White House flags were lowered to half-staff as leaders across the political spectrum mourned the former diplomat and four-star general. President Biden leading the tributes during a speech yesterday.
He's not only a dear friend and a patriot, one of our great military leaders and a man of overwhelming decency. This is the guy born son of immigrants in New York City, raised in Harlem in the South Bronx, graduated from City College in New York. And he rose to the highest ranks not only in the military, but also in areas of foreign policy and statecraft.
NBC News global security reporter Dan DeLuce joins us now with more on this. Good morning, Dan. So the president was one of many paying tribute to General Powell yesterday. Who else have we heard from?
That's right. We heard from so many former officials who served with General Powell. We heard from former Presidents Bush and Clinton. And we also heard from the Vice President and the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. Let's hear what they had to say.
He broke so many barriers, and those barriers were not easy to break by any stretch. But he did it with dignity. He did it with grace. And because of what he was able to accomplish, it really did elevate our nation in so many ways. So may he rest in peace.
Colin Powell dedicated his extraordinary life to public service because he never stopped believing in America. And we believe in America in no small part because it helped produce someone like Colin Powell. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
So there you hear what they had to say, and I think what Secretary of State Blinken said, I think many other people echoed this idea that in a way Colin Powell represented really America at its best. Someone who could rise from humble origins to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs and Secretary of State. And of course, he did blaze a trail. He was the first African-American to be National Security Advisor, to be the top military officer, to be the Secretary of State. And he was considered to be a contender for the presidency in the 90s, to the point where the Democrats were quite concerned before the 96 election. Of course, he chose not to pursue the Republican nomination. He's also someone, I think, who is a throwback and a reminder to a different time when the country was a little less divided and the Republican Party was less ideological. And it was also a time when the U.S. was a bit more powerful and had fewer challenges, for example, from China now.
Yeah, I mean, there is no doubt he is someone who broke major barriers. What do you think his greatest legacy will be?
You know, I think it's maybe two parts to that. One is this fact that he was the first African-American to serve in those roles and to really be the first African-American who was seen as a serious contender for the White House. So in a way, he kind of led the way to Barack Obama's moment. And then he also, I think he'll be remembered as a humble, kind of reserved public figure who was not about bluster. It was not about vitriol. He was sort of a voice of restraint and tolerance. And I think that is also part of his legacy. Now, of course, the Iraq War is also part of his career, too.
Yeah, I was going to say, we really can't talk about him without talking about that, the Iraq War. That was arguably a low point in his career. He was front and center, trying to gain international support for the invasion. He gave a UN speech that was later found to be based on false intelligence. How did that moment impact his career? And does it, that speech in particular, does it tarnish his legacy?
I think he definitely saw it as a blemish. He called it a blot. And what he stands apart, what's interesting is that really no other major figure involved in that Iraq war has really expressed many regrets, if any. And he has been willing to acknowledge that that was something to regret, that he was basically asked to give a speech that was based on some false information. And for someone who had really an unblemished track record, I think it was painful for him, and he did acknowledge that. But of course, the war was going to happen with or without that speech. And the Bush administration at that time had made up its mind they were going to invade Iraq, so we shouldn't put too much on it. But it is interesting. It's also a story of his humility, where he was willing to say, I'm not perfect, and that was a mistake, and he regretted it.
All right, Dan, thank you so much for that.
Let's dig a little deeper into Powell's legacy with NBC News political analyst Jonathan Alter. He's also a presidential historian and a columnist for the Daily Beast. Jonathan, great to have you with us. Thank you so much. So let's pick up on this trailblazer idea. I mean, Powell was the first Black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and first Black Secretary of State. First, I want to play a little bit of sound. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, the first Black man to hold that position. Here's what he just said yesterday about Powell.
The world lost one of the greatest leaders that we have ever witnessed.
What do you think this says about Powell's impact on the leaders that came after him? And what do we know about the role he played as really a mentor to others?
This is a huge part of Colin Powell's legacy. The armed forces in the United States are the greatest vehicle for upward mobility that we've had in this society over the last 75 to 100 years. The military has been open to advancement by African Americans and other minorities in ways that many other institutions have not. Colin Powell rose the highest, but he wasn't one of those officers who just was looking for the next promotion and not really interested in those who came behind him. And Secretary Austin is just one of many examples of African Americans who owe their careers really to Colin Powell's example, and in many cases to his specific help for them. So it's easy to forget how hard it is to be the first, and with what grace he assumed, in breaking those barriers. It becomes less difficult for those behind him because he set an example. And I think Secretary Austin makes an extraordinarily important point, not just in talking about his own close relationship with Colin Powell, but in describing all the other people that he inspired, Black and white, and all sorts of people, because Colin Powell was not into identity politics. He wasn't into politics at all, which is the reason he decided not to run for president in 1996, even though he very well might have been elected. I don't see anybody who would have stood in his way for the Republican nomination, which was eventually won by Bob Dole. I don't think Dole or Lamar Alexander or Steve Forbes or the other Republicans who ran that year could have beaten him in those primaries, and which were coming up just a couple of months after he made his decision not to run. And then he was about 15 points ahead of incumbent President Clinton in the polls. Would he have beaten Clinton? We don't know for sure, but I think the likelihood is considerable that he would have. So all of this just indicates that this was a figure beyond politics, of a stature that really is an inspiration, not just for others in the military and government, but in all areas of life.
Absolutely. I think one of the other things, especially when you put it in context with where it feels like we're at a lot of times right now in this country, is that Colin Powell was famously not tied down by party. He served under both President Bush's, but then endorsed President Obama in 2008. What do you think our current divisive political landscape can take away from his legacy?
That it's important to put country ahead of party. And, he became a Republican in 1996. Before that, he was like Eisenhower had been when he was in the military, which is there's no place for party identity when you're on active duty. And then after he left active duty, he felt initially more comfortable with the Republican Party for some years, but then felt that party had gone so far off the rails that he ended up, after January 6th, he he resigned. He left the Republican Party very explicitly early this year, but it had been more than 10 years since he could really be identified as a Republican, and he spoke at the Democratic convention. He felt so strongly that Donald Trump was, as he described it, a liar and a threat to our country, that he threw in his lot with the Democrats, and he endorsed not just not just Hillary Clinton. I think people know that he came out for Barack Obama against his friend John McCain in 2008, but he endorsed Hillary Clinton, and then this last time he gave a very strong endorsement for Joe Biden. He was very, very concerned about Donald Trump and his effect on the country, and he felt that the party that he had called home for a long time basically had gone in a direction that he felt was quite dangerous for the United States.
Jonathan Alter, your analysis, your expertise is so appreciated on a morning like this. Thank you so much for helping us remember General Colin Powell. Good to have you with us.
Thanks, Savannah.
Let's bring in now senior scholar at Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, Dr. Amisha Delja. Dr. Delja, I think we can say for both of us, we have a lot of news that we could use your insight on. So if we can, let's start with what we've been talking about, the passing of former Secretary of State Colin Powell, because a lot of people heard he was fully vaccinated, but they might not have known, that he also had other serious health conditions when he died, a cancer that weakens white blood cells as well as Parkinson's disease. How would those illnesses impact the effectiveness of the vaccines?
Well, General Powell was not only did he have multiple myeloma and Parkinson's disease, but was also 84 years old. And what that does is decreases your ability not only to fight off the virus or respond to the vaccine with the ordinary doses, but also decreases what's known as physiological reserve, that you don't have much to actually deal with the virus if you do get ill. And all of that really compounds together. And in somebody with those conditions, it's very likely that if they get a breakthrough infection, it's going to not be one of the mild ones. That's why we've recommended boosters for that group. And my understanding is General Powell had not had his booster because he became ill before his booster was scheduled, before he had a chance to get it. But all of that really underscores the fact that there is still a risk for people that have high-risk conditions, even when they're fully vaccinated. And the best way to protect them is to get more people vaccinated so case counts come down and they're less likely to encounter the virus.
Let's now stay on this idea of boosters. I know people have a lot of questions about this. So the FDA is reportedly expected to approve this idea of mixing and matching COVID vaccine boosters. So meaning you're going to get a different type of booster than the first, or maybe just your first or your first and second doses potentially. So walk us through what exactly this means. And there's already confusion surrounding boosters. What do you think this is going to mean for people who hear, okay, I might be able to get one of those mRNA ones, even if I got Johnson & Johnson the first time? And what kind of impact do you think this could have in the fight to stop the spread of the virus?
So when it comes to mixing and matching, this is something that had been known for a while, that if you mix vaccines that use different technologies, you might get a stronger boost, be more robustly immune to whatever you're fighting against. And they've done this with bird flu vaccines. And we saw this early on with AstraZeneca in the UK, that if you got one type of vaccine using a certain type of technology and then got boosted by an mRNA vaccine, by the Moderna or Pfizer vaccine, you got a bigger boost than would be expected. So what the FDA has seen is data with people who got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine getting boosted with Moderna, a different technology vaccine, having a really robust response. So that may be a way to improve vaccines, improve the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and it may make its way into other vaccines. So right now, the FDA is kind of weighing that data, and you might see a recommendation that if you've gotten the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it's okay to go get a Moderna vaccine, and it may actually protect you better. Obviously, this is going to be confusing because there's so much mixed messaging about boosters. So it's going to really need a good public health campaign to explain this. And doctors are going to have to talk to their patients about what vaccine may be the best for them. But when it comes to the trajectory of the pandemic, it's important to remember we talk a lot about boosters, but the most important thing are first and second doses. Those are the people that are getting hospitalized. Boosters protect people who are already vaccinated, who usually are not the ones that are going to be taking up hospital beds or dying. It's really people that don't have any immunity. That's who we really still need to focus on getting vaccinated.
All right, Dr. Delja, thank you so much for that.
Absolutely. Let's turn now to Haiti, where FBI agents and State Department officials have been sent to help free a group of 17 missionaries kidnapped by a violent gang. The Haitian Justice Minister told the Wall Street Journal that the gang is asking for a $17 million ransom, $1 million each. NBC News has reached out for confirmation. Let's bring in NBC News correspondent Sam Brock, who's in Miami, for more on this. Hi, Sam. Good morning. What do we know today?
Savannah, good morning. In addition to that massive figure, reportedly $17 million, the justice minister from Haiti also saying this situation could take weeks to resolve. This as we learn more information about the reported ages of the children who are being held hostage.
Overnight, a major request for ransom. The Wall Street Journal citing Haiti's justice minister reporting the gang responsible for the kidnappings wants $1 million per person. That's $17 million total. The justice minister also telling the Journal that the 5 children kidnapped include an 8-month-old baby, and the other kids were 3, 6, 14, and 15 years old. The FBI and State Department have both dispatched teams to Haiti, with White House officials keeping any potential plans to free the 17 people, nearly all Americans, under wraps.
The president has been briefed and is receiving regular updates. Due to operational considerations, we're not going to go into too much detail.
The kidnapping by a notorious gang, putting a sharper focus on Haiti, a country ravaged by extreme poverty, political instability, and natural disasters. Protesters in Miami calling on the U.S. to stop deporting Haitians. The U.S. has pledged money and training for Haitian police forces, though by one study, kidnappings have jumped 300% in 3 months. Dr. Richard Frechette, who runs a hospital in Port-au-Prince, telling us by phone he has to negotiate with gangs to get oxygen for COVID patients inside.
Sometimes we have real hair-raising days facing shortages. You can imagine if we have 65 patients, 40 will be dead in an hour the minute we don't have oxygen. That's how bad they are.
From priests and police to school children, no one in the country is off limits.
Every single day, they kidnap at least 20 to 25 people in Haiti.
Every single day?
Every single day. They kidnap you. Your family doesn't have no money. What they do, they kill you.
Hey, we have reached out to the office of Haiti's Justice Minister, Savannah. So far, I've not been able to independently confirm that information. But he did tell the Wall Street Journal that he is deeply concerned any ransom money would go for more guns and more ammunition to these gangs. Savannah, back to you.
All right, Sam Brock with some heartbreaking details there. Thank you so much.
On Capitol Hill, the clash between former President Trump and the congressional committee investigating the January 6th insurrection is heating up. The former president is now suing to try and stop the National Archives from handing over documents related to the attack. This comes as the committee prepares to vote to recommend a former top Trump advisor be held in criminal contempt. NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalas is here to help us break it all down. Danny, let's start with the former president's lawsuit. This was filed yesterday. What exactly is he claiming here?
The president procedurally has to sue not the Biden administration, but the National Archives. And that's because the Presidential Records Act takes all of those records, that's logs, all the information from Trump's White House era, and transfers them to the National Archives. So Trump correctly is suing the National Archives because they are the caretaker of the information. But now that he is no longer the president, his power to prevent disclosure of those records diminishes significantly, and he has to seek that injunction. And the Biden administration does have some say, arguably a greater say than the former president, in deciding whether or not those documents and records are ultimately released.
So executive privilege seems to be key. You said there that it diminishes, but I guess not necessarily disappears. Explain to us how that usually works when a president is no longer in office. Have any past presidents been able to retroactively protect documents?
So Trump has basically two arguments in the privilege front. One is attorney-client privilege, and the other is executive privilege. And a series of cases from back in the 70s called Nixon 1 and Nixon 2, and you can guess which president that involved, dealt with, or at least announced the existence of executive privilege. In other words, we know what it is, we know it exists, but we don't really know the contours of it, even today. And there have been cases along the way that have chipped out or defined or clarified further what executive privilege is, but not in every single situation. So Trump, the other Nixon case, Nixon 2, tells us that Trump, as an ex-president, has the power to assert executive privilege, but to what degree is still undefined. And arguably, President Biden has the ability to veto it, in a sense, to trump it, pun intended, pun not intended, Trump's own claim of executive privilege.
Okay, so let's talk about someone else involved or tied to all of this, Steve Bannon, former Trump advisor. He is in the crosshairs, if you will, of the January 6th committee. What can you tell us about the votes scheduled for later today and the legal jeopardy that Bannon is facing?
From the outset, Congress signaled that this situation, subpoenaing folks like Bannon and other former Trump orbit folks, would be different. We're going to issue subpoenas right away. We're getting these documents. But as time rolls on, it's really like it is almost every other time Congress has sought to subpoena documents from the unwilling, whether the witnesses themselves don't want to produce it, or in this case, President Trump ostensibly is refusing to let Steve Bannon disclose that information. The challenge is that Congress clearly has this broad authority to issue subpoenas and gather information. But when the rubber hits the road, Congress doesn't appear to have the actual power to enforce those subpoenas. Yes, it has a sergeant of arms that can send out and arrest these people, but that's not a practical or really reasonable way to get the information. So as is normally the case, this starts out with a lot of fanfare, ends with a lot of negotiation.
All right, well, we will keep an eye on the fanfare and the negotiations. Danny Savalas, thank you so much for that.
Now, the fight over abortion rights, the Justice Department is once again asking the Supreme Court to block the Texas law that bans most abortions. NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams breaks down the latest development here.
This is the second challenge of the Texas law to reach the Supreme Court on an emergency appeal. The court turned away the first one. It was brought by abortion providers in Texas. But the Justice Department says this lawsuit raises much different issues and is stronger. The court turned away the first appeal in early September by a 5-4 vote, saying that it presented what the majority called complex and novel questions about whether the court had the authority to hear it, given the unusual structure of SB 8 as the law is known. In this latest challenge, the Biden administration says Texas cannot take away the right of access to abortion without providing a means to defend the right in court. Unlike every other abortion restriction to come before the Supreme Court, SB 8 does not depend on state officials to enforce it. Instead, anybody can file a private lawsuit against an abortion provider and seek at least $10,000. The law has stopped nearly all abortions in the state, forcing women seeking treatment to travel elsewhere. The Justice Department says the state has essentially nullified the Supreme Court's past decisions on abortion rights and that the state has no legal power to do that. A federal judge in Texas blocked enforcement of the law in early October, but a federal appeals court put a hold on his ruling, and that allowed SB 8 to go back into effect, and that's what the Justice Department is now appealing. The issue of whether the Constitution provides a right to abortion at all will be squarely before the Supreme Court in a different case in December. The justice will hear a challenge to Mississippi's law that would ban abortion after 15 weeks. That case presents a direct challenge to the court's abortion precedents, including Roe v. Wade, which say states can't ban abortion before fetal viability. The issue in this latest case is the structure of the Texas law, whether the federal government has the legal authority to challenge it and whether the federal courts have the jurisdiction to hear the challenge. The court is signaling its intent to move quickly with this new challenge. It's ordering Texas to file a response by noon on Thursday. Savannah, Ellison?
All right, Pete Williams, thank you so much. And now it is time to get a check on your morning news now weather.
Bill Cairns, good morning. What's going on?
Well,
good
look
news,
behind
bad
me.
news.
We're going to talk a lot about we're going to talk a lot about this as we go throughout the next couple of days, maybe the next couple of weeks, hopefully maybe even the entire winter. We're going to talk about California and their rain chances because their rainy season is beginning right now. And they keep their calendar a little different than the rest of us. They have their what they call their calendar water year. It starts when the rainy season begins and then it ends when the next rainy season begins. So they just finished up the one from this last year, and they're saying it was the driest since 1924. before, about 50% of average rainfall throughout the state. So the drought just got that much worse. Again, this was the second driest in a 125-year record. So that's all the bad news. But let's look forward. Let's fill our glass back up. Okay, so we showed you how bad California is and the extreme drought throughout it. But now we are starting our water year lining up the storms. We had one little storm that's now going through the Rockies. We got another big storm that's just off the coast, and there's one behind it. So they're lining up. We're going to see a series of storms. We're going to get about 3 of them. So one comes in late tonight. It'll be with us during the day on Wednesday. Then it looks like another pretty good-sized storm comes in Thursday night into Friday. And then one comes in over the weekend. We don't want to ruin your weekend plans, but we want to fill up these reservoirs. We want to build up the snowpack at the higher elevations. So this is all good news. And the rainfall forecast over the next 7 days even gets down maybe to Los Angeles. And notice the heavier amounts in the Sierra, up to 5 inches of rain at least widespread. West-facing slopes could get 10 inches of rain in the next 7 days. So this is all fantastic news for the West, who will take every raindrop they can get. The rest of the country looking pretty mild and warm for the middle of the nation to the east, and even the Northeast after a chilly morning is looking for a sunny, beautiful afternoon. I am full of good news today.
Yeah, wow. Yay, Bill.
We love it.
Rain where we need it and calm everywhere else. That is a very good report from you. Thanks so much. We'll see you next hour.
Okay.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.